Welcome to Expositions. I'm Kevin Rhodes. Marriage, it seems, has always been a controversial subject in some ways. From the ancient practice of polygamy to the cheap divorce movement of the 20th century, to the postmodern presumption of homosexual marriage, to the sleep-around culture of just about any age, marriage has suffered attack after attack, all in the name of man trying to please himself while simultaneously making himself more and more miserable. Marriage exists in every culture as a remnant of what God created in the Garden of Eden. But it has also been corrupted in just about every way imaginable in imitation of the serpent's lies in the beginning. And that is why it is essential that we, as Christians, remind ourselves regularly of the divine view of marriage. That God rules marriage just as much as Christ rules the church. Therefore, we have no right to compromise God's truth just because society has decided to try to manipulate it. And while the Roman world did not have every specific problem we have today, they all existed in principle. And that is why it was essential for the writer of Hebrews to address it, if only briefly, in the final chapter of that epistle. As the author began exhorting those first century Jews to remain faithful, he closed by emphasizing that this faithfulness was not mere theory, but was to be exercised in the practicalities of daily life. Therefore, after encouraging them to build their relationship with one another as brethren, he reminded them of how God saw the relationship of husband and wife when he wrote this in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4. Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled. But fornicators and adulterers God will judge. So often, we spend our time fighting against Satan's distortions and attacks on marriage that we forget to reflect on God's view and His expectations of marriage. But in this one verse, the writer addresses three basic points that deserve great attention today. And the first is this: God infused marriage with tremendous value. When He said marriage is honorable among all, the word honorable has the idea of it's valuable. It has a tremendous value that we need to consider. In Proverbs 31 and verse 10, this very idea is reflected when it talks about the virtuous woman. That woman and how valuable it is if you find someone of this quality to marry. Regardless of what the Supreme Court might assume, God created marriage, and thus He's the one who gets to define it. In Genesis chapter 2, in verse 18, and then we will look a little further down the chapter immediately afterwards, it says, "And the Lord God said, It is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him." In verses 22 and 23 then, it says, "Then the rib which the Lord God had taken from man, He made into a woman, and He brought her to the man. And Adam said, This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." And that is, God recognized the need for marriage, the goodness of marriage, and also the tight bond that was intended for marriage, as we see Him condoning the words of Adam in his recognition of what this really was according to God's design. Those words matter just as much as the significance of the valuable or honorable nature of marriage described in Hebrews 13. Marriage, then, has inherent value to society. Now, this is a practical point, but sometimes we fail to appreciate it. In Ephesians chapter 2, or chapter 6, verses 2 and 3, it says this about children and the connection it has with parents. Honor your father and mother, and the reason why he says is that this is essentially good for you, that it may be well with you, a better life, that you may live long upon the earth. The nature of having parents, a man and a woman, a father and a mother, has inherent value to society, for longer lives, for a better situation overall, for a greater society in the way in which people learn to interact in a favorable way. A committed marriage usually produces better citizens. It's not an absolute rule, but it is a good principle that sociology even will back up. It teaches them within that context of that home as God designed a home to live with a positive mindset of achievement rather than the negative mindset of blame. So that children who grow up in a positive environment with both father and mother learn to look out and see what they can achieve and what is possible positively in life, where those who are deprived of this kind of background tend to blame people in life and have a mindset of that it's other people's fault. Even if they go on to achieve things, they often begin with a very negative view and never fully let go of that. This backdrop provides needed guidance also to prevent reckless blunders. It is because you have a father to lead and a mother to comfort that you have a balance of seeing love and leadership working together that helps shape you and provide the things you need to guide you to keep from making foolish decisions. It keeps you from trying to get everyone else's attention when you're being ignored, when you have a proper environment that a real strong marriage can provide. And so the foundation that marriage is for a stable home and for children cannot be replaced in the other ways that societies often try. Marriage has inherent value also just to the couples involved. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, there, as the description of what we find as a conclusion from what Adam said, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave unto his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That is what God created by making woman and bringing her to Adam, and therefore performing essentially the same marriage ceremony. This is what God designed to work and be true moving forward, and it has inherent value. There is the calming comfort of commitment that marriage, when it is truly given, what it brings in to a person's life. In Matthew chapter 19, when Jesus is asked a question about divorce, he turns it and instead makes it a question, partially at least, about marriage. When he said this in verse 5, he quoted from Genesis 2. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And then he drew this conclusion from it. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. God designed marriage to be a permanent relationship, a permanent institution, and therefore to provide stability by individual commitment of each party. And that commitment allows people to relax and to see with one another that this is what it's going to be, so we're going to work things out. And therefore, it encourages better relationships and better responsibility and better love that is truly given toward one another. The social support of belonging is a central part of this. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 31 and then verse 33, here as Paul is talking, he describes the nature of what marriage brings in this way. Again quoting from this same passage, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And then verse 33, he says this, nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. What do we have here but the social support that is brought by two people, each supporting the other in what they need? There's also then that emotional stability of intimacy, that having this one person that is truly there for you, the one person that will listen to you, the one person to confide in, the one person who will be there for you, provides a strengthening bond that only a truly intimate relationship can provide. Emotional intimacy. So that you have this care for one another, that you're going through life together and you come then to support one another through the difficult times because you have confidence the other person will still be there for you. Marriage then has inherent value also to children. We alluded to this before, but now we return to Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, that it might be well upon for you. This helps children know where and how they belong. Marriage, a father and mother, helps them see that they fit somewhere together with two people that came together so that they are even here. That was the design. Not that it would be split up so that they're confused about what marriage really is or what commitment is, because as we see, that failure of marriage leads children to question whether or not their love of their parents is really there for them when the parents are apart. Good marriages help them know that they do belong, that they belong and they're loved, and they're loved as part of the love that the husband and wife share with one another. It also establishes standards and expectations to make lifelong growth a goal. It brings them together and says, here's how we behave, and here's how you will behave. You respect me by listening to me and obeying me and coming up to these standards that are appropriate that God set. In Luke chapter 2 and verse 52, remember that Jesus, it says, grew in grace and the knowledge, he says, as we are to be. But what does he say? And the favor of both man and God. He grew in wisdom and stature, but in favor with God and man. He was growing in such a way that he was physically growing, he was spiritually growing, his relationships were growing because he had that firm foundation of what relationships should be, of what his character should be, that as he grew physically, he could then move beyond that to grow socially and spiritually too. Most of all, marriage has inherent value to souls. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 16, a verse that is misunderstood and misapplied in many ways, there Paul, in talking about marriage, is talking about the spiritual value of marriage when he writes this, "For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife?" And that comes right after he said that you are to stay together and that the only thing that would allow you to let the other person leave, that you just accept it, is that they're wanting you to somehow treat them as more important than God, and that you would act like you were bound in that way. You were a slave to the marriage more than you were a slave to God. But you see, the point is you stay with them, even if they're not a Christian, so that they might learn, and one day by observing you, one day become a Christian. You stick with it. In 1 Peter chapter 3, 1 and 2, Peter gives this specific advice to wives that their husbands could be won without a word, and that is that even though they may get to the point where they don't want to listen to the gospel, if you live the right way, you can have a strong spiritual effect so that they one day come to obey the gospel. Marriage can have a spiritual impact and should have when it's properly conducted by those who are Christians. Marriage is the first institution God created, and He did so to provide the best foundation for mankind that the world has ever known. Satan's attempts to demean marriage, to redefine marriage, and even to eliminate marriage all speak to the core power that marriage can have when we first remember the tremendous value of marriage, that he who findeth a wife findeth a good thing. Proverbs 18 verse 22 says, marriage is one of the greatest blessings we can enjoy, but only when we tap into the value that God placed there. Second of all, we need to respect the fact that God put the sexual relationship in marriage. He says, returning to Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4, that marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 3 and 4, there the Apostle Paul emphasized this in a different way when he talked about how wife and husband, either one, had no right to deprive the other when it came to the sexual relationship. It is odd, in a way though, how Satan has managed to make people think that a discussion about a sexual relationship outside of marriage is somehow normal, while making people think it is odd to talk about the sexual relationship in marriage, which is where God actually put it. You know, God deliberately created this part of marriage, not only for procreation, but primarily to cement the bond between husband and wife. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 16, this is the emphasis that Paul makes when he once more quotes from Genesis 2 and verse 24, and then says and emphasizes that one flesh aspect. He is dealing in the context with the problem of fornication, and he is arguing against fornication because that belongs only in marriage, because that's where one flesh should occur and is appropriate, and it's where God placed it. So we know then that God from the beginning created this relationship, including the physical sexual relationship, to be part of marriage and to be an important joining and an important cementing aspect of marriage, to glue people together emotionally, that they become one. Therefore, it's essential that we emphasize to young and old alike that God designed the sexual relationship, that He approves of the sexual relationship, and that He encourages the sexual relationship, but He limits the sexual relationship to marriage. In Song of Solomon, chapter 4, verse 16, through the beginning of chapter 5, verse 1, just the next one over, this is actually the place in the Song of Solomon where he alludes to this. Awake, O north wind, and come, O south. Blow upon my garden, that its spices may flow out. Let my beloved come to his garden and eat its pleasant fruits. And all she's saying is that they're on their honeymoon. I am ready. Afterwards, in verse 1 of chapter 5, I have come to my garden, my sister, my spouse. I have gathered my myrrh with my spice. I have eaten my honeycomb with my honey. I have drunk my wine with my milk. Eat, O friends, drink, yes, drink deeply, O beloved ones. And that is after the fact that this has been a wonderful thing. You see, the restriction that God has placed on the sexual relationship to keep it within marriage is not some random restriction. God knows what leads to greater joy and to a healthy sexual relationship within the monogamy of marriage. And it's not only the biblical prescription for happiness, it's also what studies have shown, that this is where happiness occurs and where the stronger sexual relationship happens. As such, a healthy biblical view of marriage means recognizing the full intent of the sexual relationship in marriage too. God created marriage to provide this intimate environment where a man and a woman could grow in both their knowledge and love for one another for decades. And while Satan can make this difficult sometimes, it should ultimately promote unity in marriage and a strong, nourishing environment as a whole. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 29, here the language once more, though general, is important for us to consider what Paul really was talking about so that we appreciate its full impact. When he said, "For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church." And he says that just before, again, he quotes from Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24. But the joy of the sexual relationship in marriage is tied directly to its purity. An important point we often forget. In Matthew 5, 27 through 32, Jesus emphasizes that we are to protect our purity even when it comes to our eyes. That our lust should be reserved, our desires should be reserved for one person and one person only, and that is the person to whom we are married. Once married, you should only have eyes for one another, and you should appreciate what you have in one another. Outside of marriage, you should have eyes for no one. Now that includes the waitress who's waiting on you. It includes anyone online that you might be looking at. It says, no, it's reserved for marriage. And that's important so that once you're married, you understand that the standard of beauty is your spouse. And that once you keep your eyes clearly focused and only give attention to your spouse in this way, that beauty will only build and grow and become more precious over time. That's marriage as it ought to be, as God designed it. Satan has introduced so many things into life to corrupt the sexual relationship in marriage. But much of what he does is simply trying to prevent it. You probably never thought of that as a temptation from Satan. But if you were tempted to not have this kind of strong sexual relationship in marriage, you are falling into one of Satan's traps too. So I now hope you realize it is exactly that, a temptation. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 5, don't defraud your partner in marriage of this which God designed specifically for marriage. Now, thirdly, we consider again from our text what he says, and this time going and considering the negative. Because God rejects all attempts to circumvent his plan for marriage when he says, again in Hebrews 13:4, marriage is honorable among all and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, here we find Paul makes a complete list that would include both adulterers and fornicators of every kind. Homosexual, heterosexual, doesn't matter. But all these can be a plan, an attempt to get around marriage. The last portion of the verse is more important then than people often think. For example, some have suggested that those who commit fornication are essentially married in God's eyes. This verse disputes that idea entirely. He makes a distinction that they aren't married. It is also clear from this that you do not become married just because you have committed fornication for a long time. And so the idea of the kind of marriage that's recognized common law in a given country, that doesn't please God just because you've been committing fornication for 7 years. What the law might recognize for legal purposes in common law marriage is not something God recognizes for moral purposes because you've never made the commitment, you've never done anything except for break what God's law was. It is also significant that he mentions both fornication and adultery because there's an important difference between the two. But first we consider that God will judge all who commit fornication. In 1 Corinthians 6, verse 18, Paul wrote, "Flee fornication." Why? Because fornication is essentially a shortcut. It ignores all the responsibilities of marriage in order to briefly, though imperfectly, take advantage of the physical relationship that's reserved only for marriage. It does not matter whether a couple ignored God's word before they were married or after they were married. The problem is where sexual activity occurs outside of the marriage bond. Many have attempted to justify this, especially in recent years, even trying to define fornication so narrowly that few actions would qualify. You might think of Bill Clinton's testimony if you remember that. However, this is more than lasciviousness, and that's an important distinction. Lasciviousness or lewdness emphasizes provoking desire, while fornication is acting on that desire specifically in a sexual way with someone else. Lasciviousness includes pornography and dancing and some of those other things like it that intend to provoke lust in us. But fornication is actually engaging in a sexual act. But here's the thing. God will also judge adulterers. Adultery is a sin against marriage itself. While someone committing fornication while married, certainly that constitutes adultery, the sin then is twofold. Fornication is the physical sin, the act of a sexual relationship with someone other than your spouse. But adultery is the sin of acting without regard for the commitment of marriage. It's a sin against marriage itself. And therefore it's an abuse of a marriage that's already constituted, as if it's nothing, as if it didn't matter, as if it didn't happen. Where you are introducing things, or in this case, someone else, into your relationship that doesn't belong there. You see, once you've made that commitment in marriage, you have a responsibility to that person and to that marriage. That's why in Matthew chapter 5, 27 and 28, that if you look on a woman to lust after her, you have committed adultery already in your heart. Now, sure, there could be a little bit of hyperbole he's using, but the point is this, that the fact that you're entering into something by looking on someone that you don't have a right to look on, that is bringing in something you're not allowed to do in marriage and therefore introducing a false element. It also therefore includes all who divorce and remarry contrary to God's marriage law because they're sinning against the institution of marriage just by being married. That's the point he makes in Matthew chapter 5, 31 and 32. That's why it is adultery. But even divorce is a form of adultery when the person had no biblical right to leave because it violated God's marriage laws, and that's why it's called such by Jesus in Matthew chapter 19 and verse 9. So now we move to that verse, and with all that being said, it's important to see a distinction that's made in Matthew 19:9 with these two words. The reason given that allows for divorce biblically is fornication. It's not lasciviousness, and it's not technically adultery. Jesus was specific for a reason. It was only the act of replacing with another that unique aspect of marriage, sexuality, that made God willing to allow for divorce and remarriage. Of course, the most important part of this statement is the fact that God will judge. He will recognize what you're doing and judge accordingly. It is sad how many people get upset if you point out what the Bible says about their lifestyle. Whether homosexuality, shacking up, divorce for any reason, or anything else, without realizing that God has already said He condemns such actions. All of these things are attempts to get around what God said instead of submitting to it in marriage. And that's always a problem. Marriage is a blessing from God, and we should appreciate it as such. And the instruction of our youth, of young couples, and of all should reflect God's view and be unashamed. The divine view of marriage has been consistent since the Garden of Eden. God infused marriage with tremendous value. God put the sexual relationship in marriage. And thirdly, God rejects all attempts to circumvent His plan for marriage. The fact that the writer would include this kind of exhortation in an epistle dedicated to addressing a potential apostasy is telling. During this time period, one of the problems the early church was beginning to face was Gnosticism, a belief that separated what you did physically from your situation spiritually. Some people believed that holiness depended upon abstaining from any kind of physical pleasure. Others believed you could indulge in whatever you wished without it affecting your spiritual situation. The writer corrects both of these views in this one single verse. Satan has been very effective getting his view of marriage into society. It is essential that we not fall into that trap, but instead hold fast to God's view and make that view our own view. You know, marriage is at the heart of so many people's lives. The problem is they haven't let God in to rule it. I'm Kevin Rhodes. Thank you for watching Expositions.